A fun outing with friends turns into every parent's worst nightmare. Family and friends rally together to assist law enforcement in the search for a missing girl. As the investigation unfolds, suspicion falls on an unexpected person. However, due to conflicting statements, the FBI is left with only forensic evidence to rely on. 11-year-old Brittany Martinez's parents knew their daughter was not the type to run away. Something had to have happened to her, something terrible. When they couldn't find her anywhere in their quiet Illinois neighborhood, they had no choice but to call the police. I'm Jim Carlstrom, former head of the FBI field office in New York. Our team was called in to untangle conflicting statements, false leads, and missing clues. We were determined to solve this case. Chicago and its surrounding suburbs are home to nearly 10 million people from diverse social and economic backgrounds. The area's economic and cultural appeal attracts many residents, and families in particular favor the suburban community of Elgin, where this case began. On May 8, 1997, around 5 p.m., Wendy Howlett returned to Elgin after spending the day at Chicago's Shedd Aquarium with her 5-year-old son and 11-year-old daughter, Brittany. Wendy had volunteered to chaperone Brittany's class on their school field trip to the famous aquarium. It was a wonderful day, Wendy recalled. I had 5 of Brittany's friends with me, and they had so much fun. They loved the sharks and turtles. We ate outside, watching boats and planes go by. Brittany had an amazing time. After returning home, the kids were eager to enjoy the warm spring evening. Brittany, full of energy, wanted to go outside. As Wendy was upstairs, she heard her daughter calling out to her, "Mom, can I go to the park?" It was getting late, and Wendy hesitated at first. She initially assumed Brittany wanted to go with just one friend, which made her reluctant to allow it. But when she realized there were 5 of them together, she changed her mind. "Okay, but be back by 6. Have fun." The park was only 2 blocks away, and Wendy felt comfortable letting her daughter go. Her young son, however, was too little for the park, so she decided to take him to visit her sister, Pam, who had recently moved into a new house just a short walk away. Before leaving, Wendy wrote Brittany a note and ran into a neighbor outside. She asked him to pass along a message if he happened to see Brittany. If she returned before 6, she could either wait in the apartment or come to her aunt's house. About 45 minutes later, Wendy returned home, but Brittany wasn't there. At first, she wasn't too worried. She figured her daughter was still at the park. While waiting for her brother to pick her up for work, she quickly made dinner for her son. At 6:20 p.m., Wendy's husband, Scott, arrived home. "I have to head to work," she told him, grabbing her things. "Brittany is still at the park with her friends." Scott's response made her freeze. "What friends? They're all outside, but Brittany isn't with them." Wendy rushed to the window and saw Brittany's friends gathered in front of the house. Immediately, she ran outside and asked where her daughter was. "She went with Eddie to Aunt Pam's house to meet you," the girls replied. Wendy felt her stomach tighten. "But I'm already back. Have you seen her since then?" The girls shook their heads. A sinking feeling set in. She grabbed the phone and called her sister. "Pam, is Brittany with you?" "No," came the unsettling reply. "I saw her at the park about half an hour ago, but she's not here now." Minutes ticked by, and worry turned to panic. Brittany was gone. As time passed, Wendy's unease deepened. She knew Brittany wouldn't simply wander off without telling someone where she was going. Something wasn't right. Her husband, Scott, immediately went out on foot to search for their daughter. He first checked the park, then the streets leading to Aunt Pam's house, hoping to spot her along the way. But there was no sign of Brittany. By 8 p.m., after nearly 2 hours of searching, there was still no trace of her. That's when Wendy knew something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, she grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, patrol officers from the Elgin Police Department were dispatched. Sergeant Robert Beater, who was a detective at the time, understood the urgency of the situation. "When it comes to missing children, every second counts," he later recalled. "The first thing we do is verify the situation. Sometimes kids hide or fall asleep somewhere, but we knew this case was different." When officers arrived at the Martinez home, they began their standard protocol. They first searched the house to rule out the possibility that Brittany was hiding or had returned unnoticed. But Brittany wasn't there. Wendy provided the officers with a detailed description of her daughter. She had last been seen wearing blue jeans, a blue t-shirt, yellow socks, and white sneakers. The possibility that Brittany had run away was considered, but Wendy quickly dismissed the idea. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset, Wendy told the officers. We had such a great day at the aquarium. It would be completely out of character for her to just disappear. Next, investigators turned to the neighbors. One man reported seeing Brittany and her friends return from the park around 5:50 p.m., just 20 minutes before Wendy came home. He also confirmed that he had delivered Wendy's message, telling Brittany she could either wait at home or head to Aunt Pam's place. She seemed excited to go to her aunt's house, the neighbor noted. Then he recalled something else. About 5 minutes later, he heard Brittany carrying her bicycle up the basement stairs. I stepped outside and offered to help her, he said. She thanked me, then rode off in the direction of her aunt's house. That was the last time anyone saw her. As news of Brittany's disappearance spread, more neighbors and police officers joined the search. By 9 p.m., Wendy's younger brother, Eddie, arrived at the house. He had just learned about Brittany's disappearance and was in shock. I saw her outside around 6, right before I left to pick up Wendy for work, Eddie told his sister. When you weren't home, I left without you. Eddie decided to check the park again. Meanwhile, officers expanded their search radius, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Brittany. But no one had. Despite the growing concern, there were no signs of a struggle. No one had heard screaming or seen any suspicious activity in the neighborhood. It was unsettling, Detective Beater recalled. It was like she had vanished in the thin air. As the hours passed and darkness set in, the search became even more desperate. Officers called in a helicopter to scan the area from above. Search teams scoured parks, alleyways, and side streets. But Brittany and her bicycle were nowhere to be found. Back at the house, Wendy was barely holding herself together. I wanted to go out there and search myself, but they told me to stay home in case she came back, she later recalled. I waited and waited, but nothing happened. By midnight, the realization was setting in. Brittany wasn't just missing. She was in danger. By midnight, panic had fully set in. Brittany had now been missing for over 6 hours, and every minute that passed without a sign of her deepened the family's fear. Wendy was breaking down. It wasn't like her to just disappear, she later said. I knew, deep down, I knew something terrible had happened. The police intensified their search efforts. Officers rechecked Brittany's usual routes, questioned more neighbors, and even called local hospitals in case an injured child had been admitted. Still, there was nothing. Around 2 a.m., investigators returned to Wendy's home to conduct another search. This time, they decided to check the basement, the same place where the neighbor had last heard Brittany carrying her bicycle upstairs. And that's when they found something disturbing. Brittany's bicycle was there, leaning against the wall. It was not locked up, which was unusual. This was Brittany's prized possession, Wendy explained. She wouldn't just leave it like that. She always locked it up. Investigators carefully examined the bike. It appeared untouched. No damage, no visible signs of a struggle. But this discovery raised more questions than answers. If Brittany had taken her bike out to ride to her aunt's house, why was it back in the basement? And more importantly, where was Brittany? By the early morning hours, the police began shifting their focus. If Brittany had not run away, and if no one had witnessed an abduction, was it possible that someone close to her was involved? The Elgin Police Department decided to bring in the FBI. The moment we got the call, we knew we had to move fast, said Special Agent Mike White from the FBI's Chicago field office. Statistics show that if a child is abducted, the first 24 hours are the most crucial. One of the FBI's first steps was to check the state's offender registry. Our priority was to determine if there were any known sex offenders in the area, White explained. The database revealed that a registered sex offender lived just a few blocks away. The man was currently homeless and living out his van. Agents quickly located him and searched his vehicle, but there were no signs of Brittany. He also had a solid alibi, confirmed by multiple witnesses. Meanwhile, investigators decided to re-interview Brittany's family members and close acquaintances. That's when they began to focus on one person in particular, Eddie Mielke, Brittany's uncle. Eddie Mielke, 20 years old, was Wendy's younger brother. He was one of the last people to see Brittany on the day she disappeared. When police first spoke to him, he seemed cooperative, explaining that he left home around 6 p.m. and didn't know what had happened after that. But when detectives asked him to come to the station for an official statement, his demeanor suddenly changed. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Eddie snapped. "You think I had something to do with it?" Detectives were taken aback. They hadn't accused him of anything, just asked him to provide a timeline of his whereabouts. This reaction was odd, one investigator later recalled. Most family members were desperate to help, but Eddie got defensive, almost angry. That raised a red flag. Despite his initial outburst, Eddie agreed to be questioned at the station. Once there, detectives asked if they could search his car, a routine request to eliminate any doubts. "Sure, go ahead," Eddie said, shrugging. Inside his car, officers found a vacuum cleaner and a trash bin. Not unusual, considering Eddie worked cleaning buildings at night. But what investigators really wanted was a statement. "We needed to confirm his timeline," said Detective Robert Beater, "where he was, who he was with, and if anyone could verify his whereabouts." As the interview continued, something became increasingly clear. Eddie's story didn't add up, and soon police would uncover the first major crack in his alibi, one that would make him the prime suspect. As detectives pressed Eddie Mielke for details, his story started to fall apart. He claimed that after leaving his sister Wendy's house at 6 p.m., he went straight to work. But when investigators checked his workplace, his boss hadn't seen him arrive until 8:30 p.m., over 2 hours later. That left a critical gap in his timeline. When confronted with this inconsistency, Eddie changed his story. "Maybe I lost track of time," he muttered. "Maybe I stopped somewhere on the way." Then, detectives checked a convenience store security camera, where Eddie claimed to have stopped for cigarettes around 6:45 p.m. The footage showed dozens of customers, but Eddie wasn't one of them. Now, it wasn't just a gap in his timeline. Eddie had lied. Investigators decided to question Wendy again about her brother. "He's a little slow," she admitted. "He went to a special education school when we were kids. He doesn't have many friends, no girlfriend, and mostly keeps to himself." She was struggling to process the idea that Eddie could be involved. "Is there anything else you can tell us?" an agent asked. Wendy hesitated. Finally, she said, "He came back late that night, around 10:30. He was acting different, almost nervous. I thought it was just because he was upset about Brittany being missing. But now, I don't know." Detectives decided to bring Eddie back for another interview. At first, he stuck to his story, repeating the same weak alibi. But then, something strange happened. As he rubbed his temples and closed his eyes, he whispered something under his breath. Detectives leaned in. She was in Elgin, near Elgin. She was wet and cold. The room fell silent. Detectives asked, "Was she breathing?" "No." "Was she bleeding?" "No." Then Eddie opened his eyes, looked at the officers, and made a shocking statement. "I know she's dead." Eddie claimed he had a vision about Brittany's fate. He described seeing her in an old gray car with two men drinking beer. He saw a dirt road, farmhouses, rocks, and a creek. He said the men had touched her all over and that he knew she was dead. Detectives weren't buying it. "This wasn't some psychic vision," one agent later said. "This sounded like someone describing something they had actually seen." They immediately called Wendy back to the station. As soon as she saw Eddie, she noticed he had been crying. "Eddie," she said softly, "what do you need to tell me?" His face twisted in frustration. "It wasn't me," he yelled. "They're trying to make me believe I did something I didn't do." He then backtracked completely, saying, "Brittany is probably still alive. We have to find her." Despite his erratic statements, there was still no physical evidence linking Eddie to the crime. For now, they had to let him go. But investigators were more certain than ever. Eddie knew more than he was admitting. And soon, a devastating discovery would prove them right. Days passed with no sign of Brittany. Search efforts continued, but as time stretched on, hope began to fade. Then, on May 17, 1997, 9 days after Brittany disappeared, a couple on a canoe trip made a horrifying discovery. As they paddled down the Kishwaukee River, about 17 miles, 28 kilometers, from Elgin, they spotted something unusual on a sandbank. At first, they thought it was a pile of clothing, but as they got closer, they realized it was a body. Authorities arrived quickly. The girl's upper body was exposed, and she was severely decomposed. A forensic team examined the clothing still on her body. Though her shirt was missing, her jeans, socks, and sneakers matched exactly what Brittany had been wearing the day she vanished. It was impossible to identify her at first glance, a detective later recalled. But we knew. Deep down, we all knew. An autopsy confirmed the worst. It was Brittany. The medical examiner determined that Brittany had died from asphyxiation. She had been suffocated. There were 2 strips of duct tape found on her face. A large bruise covered her cheek, and within it, investigators found a bite mark. Her jeans were unbuttoned, and her underwear was inside out. The most chilling detail? Her body showed evidence of sexual assault, either shortly before or immediately after her death. The examiner took tissue samples and sent them for forensic testing. Investigators noted something deeply unsettling. The location where Brittany's body was found closely resembled the vision Eddie Mielke had described. A shallow creek, a dirt road, nearby farmhouses. It was all eerily accurate. This wasn't a coincidence, said Special Agent Mike White. Eddie knew this place. He had either been there before or he had been there with Brittany. Detectives obtained a court order to collect blood, hair, and saliva samples from Eddie Mielke. They also took impressions of his teeth to compare against the bite mark on Brittany's face. A forensic odontologist examined the bite mark closely. At first, it appeared to match Eddie's dental impression, but because of decomposition, the skin had distorted, making a definitive match impossible. Investigators turned their focus to Eddie's car. It was impounded and subjected to a full forensic examination. On the floor mat, technicians found small red stains. On the lid of a fast food cup, they found dried red smudges. They ran DNA tests on both samples. When the results came back, they stunned even the most seasoned investigators. The blood was Brittany's. It was a 1 in 6.4 million chance that it belonged to anyone else. That was all police needed. On December 18, 1997, more than 7 months after Brittany disappeared, Eddie Mielke was arrested and charged with murder, aggravated kidnapping, sexual assault of a minor. Wendy, still grieving her daughter's death, was shocked. "I lost my daughter," she later said, her voice breaking. "And now, they were telling me I was about to lose my brother too." She refused to believe Eddie was guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. Eddie Mielke was formally charged with first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and the sexual assault of a minor. His arrest sent shockwaves through the family. Wendy was devastated. "I had already lost my daughter," she said. "Now, they were telling me I was losing my brother too, but I just couldn't believe it. He would never do this." Her entire family was divided. Some refused to believe Eddie was capable of such a crime, while others couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence against him, desperate to clear Eddie's name, when he publicly stated that her brother couldn't have driven to the river where Brittany's body was found, because he had never been there before. But investigators knew that wasn't true. She had previously told them that their father used to take them to an old railroad museum in Union, Illinois, not far from the exact location where Brittany was found. When detectives pointed this out, Wendy suddenly changed her story, backtracking on her original statement. Her sudden shift in testimony only made the prosecution's case stronger. "This was one of the hardest parts of the case," said an investigator. "We weren't just investigating crime. We were watching a family fall apart." On April 21st, 2000, nearly 3 years after Brittany's murder, the trial of Edward Mielke began. The prosecution laid out their case. Eddie was one of the last people to see Brittany alive. He lied about his whereabouts the night she disappeared. He provided details about Brittany's death that he shouldn't have known, including an eerily accurate description of the location where she was found. Brittany's blood was found inside his car. The defense, however, tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses placing Eddie with Brittany at the time of the crime. The bite mark was inconclusive due to decomposition. The DNA evidence, while linking Brittany's blood to Eddie's car, didn't prove how it got there or when. After weeks of emotional testimony, the jury reached a verdict. The jury did not find Eddie guilty of premeditated murder. They couldn't conclude that he had planned to kill Brittany. However, they did convict him of felony murder, meaning Brittany had been killed in the course of another crime, such as kidnapping or sexual assault. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison. Wendy was shattered. "I couldn't breathe when they read the verdict," she later said. "It felt like my world had just ended all over again." Even after his conviction, Wendy maintained Eddie's innocence. "I lost my daughter. I lost my brother. I lost everything," she said. Despite the conviction, some questions remain unanswered. Did Eddie act alone? No one else was ever charged, but the details of his vision suggested someone else may have been involved. Why did Brittany's bike end up back in the basement? If she had ridden off to her aunt's house, how did her bike return? Though Eddie never confessed, investigators remain certain that he was responsible. "We may never know every detail," one FBI agent admitted. "But we know this. Brittany didn't just vanish into thin air." Edward Mielke remains incarcerated, serving his 75-year sentence with no chance of parole. Brittany's family, despite years of pain and division, has tried to move forward, but the wounds of that day will never fully heal. "Brittany was just a child," Wendy said. "She deserved to grow up, to live her life, and that was taken from her."